They say that home is where the heart is, but what happens when your own blood tells you you'll die in that very home, as if your presence there is nothing more than an expiration date set in stone? I remember the moment my son, Daniel, said those words, not with anger or cruelty, but with a quiet, clinical certainty that made the sentence hit harder than any shout. "You'll die in this house," he said, his voice calm but final, as though I were a piece of furniture he had decided to retire, no longer useful, best put away somewhere out of sight. It wasn't the threat I had feared in my younger years when disagreements were louder, when passion might flare and anger would rumble between us like a storm. No, this was worse because it was spoken softly, like a verdict passed down after careful consideration, the kind of verdict that felt inevitable and immutable. That sentence echoed inside me for days, weeks, a haunting lullaby reminding me that in the house I had called home for more than 40 years, I was no longer welcome as a person, but only as an inconvenience to be managed, moved, and ultimately removed. I'm 81 years old now, and I live in a modest condo a few blocks from the train station, surrounded by the distant hum of the city and the occasional chirp of sparrows in the courtyard. It's quiet here, much quieter than the house on Ashgrove Lane where Daniel grew up, where I raised him and his sister, where every corner holds a memory and every creak in the floor sounds like a whisper from the past. That house was once full of life. Children's laughter bouncing off the walls, the clatter of pots and pans, and the steady rhythm of family dinners that lasted longer than necessary because none of us wanted to leave the table. But somewhere along the way, as years piled up and faces around the table changed, my place there began to shift, shrinking like a shadow being swallowed by the lengthening dusk. When Daniel said those words, it was during a Sunday afternoon visit, the kind that had become increasingly rare and uncomfortable over the years. The house looked different, cleaner, almost sterile, as if every surface had been scrubbed not only of dirt, but of personality and warmth. The furniture was arranged differently, not quite matching the way I remembered it, as if someone else had redrawn the blueprint of my life without asking for my permission. Carla, his wife, was bustling about in the kitchen, her movements quick and efficient, slicing vegetables with mechanical precision. I sat in the living room, clutching a teacup that felt foreign in my hands, the steam rising in lazy curls but offering no comfort. Daniel stood near the window, gazing out as if the world beyond was more interesting than the conversation we were about to have. He turned to me then, his face unreadable, the faintest hint of regret or hesitation flickering behind his eyes before vanishing. "Mom," he said, choosing his words carefully as though weighing each syllable. "We've been talking, and we think it's time to start making some changes here. For your comfort, you understand. It's about safety and what's best for you." His voice was gentle but firm, the kind of tone that signals the end of discussion before it begins. "We're thinking about converting part of the house into a granny flat, with caregivers coming in on a schedule. It'll be easier for all of us if you move downstairs permanently. And maybe, eventually, you'll consider something smaller. Something simpler." He avoided my eyes as he spoke, as if saying it aloud was somehow a betrayal. I remember feeling a sudden chill crawl up my spine, though the room was warm, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the hardwood floor. I swallowed hard, trying to steady the lump that formed in my throat, but I couldn't find the words to protest. What could I say? That I had paid for that house? That I had swept those floors with my own hands? That I had tended the garden, the same patch of earth that now lay covered in neat rows of unfamiliar plants? Daniel didn't say it outright, but the message was clear. I was no longer the matriarch, no longer the woman whose voice shaped the home. I was an obstacle, a responsibility, a fading relic to be gently ushered aside. The days that followed were a slow unraveling of my sense of belonging. The familiar sounds of the house became alien. My bedroom was moved downstairs away from the main family spaces for easier access. The curtains were replaced with blackout shades. My favorite armchair was taken to the attic, replaced by a modern recliner that squeaked and felt cold. My collection of old photographs, black and white images of Daniel as a boy, his first steps, birthday parties, were packed away in boxes labeled storage. Even the small kitchen where I once baked raspberry scones on quiet Saturday mornings now seemed like a museum exhibit, neat and sanitized, without a trace of the warmth I had poured into it. My car keys were misplaced and then quietly found in the glove compartment of Daniel's SUV, which he insisted I use for errands, though I barely drove anymore. The bank statements began arriving at their address, the bills managed without my input. I felt like I was fading into the wallpaper, becoming a background fixture rather than a participant in my own life. There was no dramatic confrontation, no shouting match. Instead, there was silence, the kind of silence that wraps around you like a shroud, smothering your voice before you can find it. Each day, I watched as the family moved on without me, as plans were made in hushed tones just beyond my hearing, as decisions were taken with a nod that did not include me. It was as if I had become a ghost, haunting the edges of my own home. I was still there physically, but my presence no longer mattered. It took weeks before I even dared to speak about it, and when I did, my words seemed to fall flat, unheard or ignored. I felt the weight of decades pressing down on me, the years I'd given to this family, the sacrifices made in silence, the love unacknowledged and repaid with this slow, quiet exile. And yet, beneath the crushing loneliness, a small ember of defiance began to glow. I remembered that the house, with its creaky floors and peeling paint, was still mine on paper. The deed, tucked away in an old filing cabinet, bore my name alone. Despite the erosion of respect and belonging, the legal truth remained intact. That realization was like a breath of fresh air in a room grown stale. One night, after everyone had gone to bed, I climbed the stairs to the attic, a place I hadn't been in years, and found the heavy leather-bound folder where I kept the deed and related documents. My hands trembled slightly as I touched the embossed letters on the front, feeling the cool weight of authority in my grasp. I sat on the wooden floor surrounded by dust motes dancing in the single beam of moonlight through the attic window and read the papers again, slow and steady. It was mine. Still mine. The house was mine. Not theirs. Not yet theirs. I realized then that this wasn't just about bricks and mortar or the logistics of caregiving. It was about control, about identity, about being seen or erased, and in that moment the ember flared into a quiet fire. I wasn't done. I wouldn't let myself be written out of the story any more than I had been allowed to write it in the first place. The house, my home, would not be the cage where I was left to fade away. I would find a way out, not just to survive, but to reclaim the life that had been slipping through my fingers like sand. I sat there in the attic until dawn, the silence broken only by the distant call of an owl and the occasional creak of the old roof settling. By the time the first light spilled across the horizon, I had made a decision. Tomorrow I would start the process to sell the house. Not because I wanted to leave, but because I needed to take back control. Because sometimes the hardest thing a woman can do is to say no to the past, to expectations, to those who think they can decide for her, and in saying no, to say yes to herself. I tucked the papers back into their folder and climbed down the stairs, my heart heavy but steady. The house still held memories, some too precious to ever forget. But the woman who had built those memories was ready to build something new, and this time, she would be the one holding the pen. The moment I truly understood what had changed, what had been lost beyond repair, was not marked by a dramatic shouting match or a sudden storm of words. No, it was far more subtle and cold, a quiet unveiling of the truth wrapped in the guise of care and concern. It was the afternoon Daniel sat me down at the kitchen table, a place that once held so much laughter and warmth, now transformed into a stage for a conversation I wished I could have walked away from. His eyes, usually so full of that familiar spark I remembered from his childhood, were instead veiled with a kind of resigned weariness, as though he bore the weight of a difficult burden he had been carrying alone for months. Carla hovered nearby, busying herself with arranging plates and wiping crumbs off the counter, her smile tight and practiced, never quite reaching her eyes. That day, the house seemed colder somehow, the walls thinner, and the silence between words heavier. Daniel began by telling me about plans he and Carla had made, plans that involved changes to the house, to my life, to what I thought was ours together. He spoke softly, explaining how they had met with a contractor to convert the upstairs into a separate living space, a granny flat where caregivers could come and go on a schedule, ensuring I would be safe without having to move far. They had thought it through, carefully, he said, so I wouldn't feel uprooted but supported, protected. I remember nodding at first, trying to grasp what he was saying, trying to believe this was about my well-being and not about control. But then he looked at me directly and said, "Mom, you don't have to worry about managing the house anymore. We'll take care of it. You can rest. You won't have to carry those heavy bags or climb those stairs. We just want what's best for you." His voice was gentle, but the message beneath it was clear. I was no longer capable, no longer needed to be in charge. I was becoming a child again, someone to be watched over rather than listened to. Carla chimed in, her tone light but insistent, reminding me that the house was big and difficult to maintain, and that it was really for my comfort that they were proposing these changes. They had even started reorganizing some of the furniture, moving my favorite armchair downstairs without asking. They said it would be easier for me to have everything close by. They framed it as love and concern, but I felt the sting of dismissal more sharply than any kindness. I wanted to tell them that I had cared for that house with my own hands for decades, that every floorboard held a story I had lived, that every creak was a familiar friend. But the words caught in my throat, because I knew they had already made up their minds, that my feelings were no longer part of the equation. That same afternoon, I found myself standing in the hallway outside my old bedroom, the one I had slept in for so many years. It was now empty, the bed stripped and made up with sterile white sheets that felt cold and unwelcoming. I traced my fingers over the door frame, feeling the worn paint beneath my skin, as if touching the edges of a fading dream. Daniel's voice echoed from the kitchen, talking quietly to Carla about the logistics, how they planned to have someone check in every 2 hours, how the stairs would be off limits, how I was safer this way. I understood then that I was being gently pushed out, relegated to a space where my presence was more manageable, more convenient. It wasn't a rebellion or a fight. It was a quiet surrender of my role as the keeper of that home. The following days were a blur of small changes and silences. The locks on the front door were changed, and I was told it was for security reasons, though no one asked me if I wanted the new keys. My mail was rerouted to their address, and calls from the bank and utility companies began arriving without my knowledge. My car, once a symbol of independence, was parked in the garage, while Daniel insisted I use his SUV for any errands, insisting it was safer and easier. I felt myself shrinking, fading, becoming invisible in the very place that had once been the center of my life. One morning, as I sat alone at the breakfast table, the sunlight streaming through the kitchen window, catching the dust motes in lazy spirals, Daniel came in holding a small envelope. He placed it gently in front of me and said, "Mom, this is the paperwork for the house. I thought you should have it." I looked down and saw the documents inside. The papers that once felt like a shield now felt like a weight. My name was still there, of course, but the signatures beneath it were his and Carla's. Signatures on papers I hadn't been asked to sign, on decisions made in my absence. The house was already theirs in every way that mattered, though the legal transfer was not yet complete. I felt a strange numbness settle over me, as if my grip on the life I had built was slipping through my fingers like fine sand. That night, unable to sleep, I wandered through the rooms of the house, my footsteps echoing in the silence. I paused in the living room, my eyes catching the framed photograph on the mantelpiece, the one from Daniel's wedding day, a moment frozen in time when everything had seemed full of promise. I touched the glass lightly, my reflection mingling with the faces smiling back at me, and I felt a profound sense of loss. Not just of a house, but of my place in the story of my family, of the respect and recognition that had quietly eroded. It was then that the truth became unavoidable. I was no longer a matriarch, no longer the center of this household. I was an afterthought, a guest in my own home, my presence tolerated only as long as it did not disrupt the carefully curated image of their lives. The words Daniel had spoken, the cold certainty of "you'll die in this house," were not a prophecy, but a verdict, a sentence passed down without trial or appeal. They meant that my time here was limited, that I was to be managed, moved, and eventually removed, all under the guise of love and care. The catalyst, that moment of clarity and heartbreak, ignited something deep inside me, a fierce resolve not to vanish quietly, not to surrender without a fight. It was the beginning of a journey I had not planned, but was determined to navigate with as much dignity and strength as I could muster. The house, with its faded wallpaper and creaking floors, was no longer a sanctuary but a battleground for my right to exist on my own terms. In the weeks that followed, as the plans for renovation progressed and the caregivers were scheduled, I began to gather my strength quietly, seeking allies in unlikely places and reclaiming the fragments of my independence. I started to understand that sometimes the greatest acts of courage are not loud declarations, but small, deliberate steps toward reclaiming one's life. The decision to sell the house was not made in anger or haste, but as a conscious act of reclaiming agency, a refusal to be sidelined and erased. Looking back, I see that day as the true beginning of my awakening, the moment when betrayal became a catalyst for survival and reinvention. It was the moment I chose not to die in that house, not physically, but in spirit, and instead set out to build a life where I could live fully, unapologetically, and on my own terms. After the conversation that shifted everything, the house I had known for decades began to change in ways that felt both subtle and suffocating, like water slowly filling a vessel until there was no air left to breathe. It was not one moment, but a series of small, quiet erosions that chipped away at my place there, at my sense of self and belonging. Each day brought another subtle reminder that the life I had built was no longer mine to live fully, that the home I had paid for and cared for was becoming a carefully managed space in which my needs and desires were secondary, if considered at all. The first escalation was not loud or violent, but a creeping, persistent squeeze of control, a narrowing of options disguised as concern and practicality. The morning after Daniel and Carla's talk, I woke to find my bedroom door unlocked, the curtains drawn tight shut. When I pushed them open, the familiar sunlight that once streamed through the window was now blocked by heavy blackout shades, the soft golden glow replaced by a muted gray. It felt as if the room was being prepared for someone else, someone who might not want to be disturbed by the rhythms of the day or the changing light. My favorite armchair, the one I had spent countless hours sitting in with a book or knitting needles in hand, was gone. Carla told me it had been moved downstairs for safety. There was a new recliner in its place, sleek and modern, but cold and unfamiliar, as if it belonged to a stranger who had no memory of the countless evenings I had spent there. At the kitchen table, where I had once been the undisputed center, pouring coffee and dishing out advice, Carla and Daniel now coordinated schedules and plans without looking my way. The fridge was filled with carefully labeled containers of pre-cut vegetables and protein bars, none of which I recognized as food I would choose. My old jars of preserves, gifts from friends and neighbors, had been boxed and placed on a high shelf out of reach. My own pantry, once bursting with homemade jams and baking supplies, was reduced to a sterile space with minimal essentials. It was as if the house was being sanitized not only of dust, but of the traces of my life. One afternoon, I realized my car keys were missing. When I asked Daniel, he replied without looking up from his phone, "They're in the glove compartment of my SUV. I thought it'd be easier if you used that for errands." I wanted to protest, to remind him that I had driven my own car for years, that I was still capable, but his tone shut down the conversation before it began. I felt the sting of infantilization, the assumption that I needed to be managed, that my autonomy was negotiable. The small independence I clung to was being eroded piece by piece. The changes crept into every corner of the house. New locks were installed on the front door without my knowledge, and the keys were kept by Daniel and Carla. My mail began to be forwarded to their address. Important bills and notices came to me only after I asked, and even then, the explanations were clipped and distracted. I watched as my presence was reduced to a series of appointments and checklists, doctor visits, caregiver schedules, medication reminders. The vibrant, chaotic life of family faded into a sterile routine where I was more a patient than a mother. Even my voice was diminished. When I expressed concerns or preferences, I was met with polite smiles and quick dismissals. "We want what's best for you," they would say, as if repeating a mantra that excused the absence of real dialogue. I was told I was overthinking, that I should trust them. I tried to remind myself that they meant well, but the feeling of being sidelined, of my life being micromanaged without my consent, grew heavier with each passing day. One evening, after a particularly quiet dinner, I found myself standing in the hallway, watching Daniel and Carla prepare for their evening out. They talked about plans, parties, outings that I was no longer invited to. I remembered the years I had spent hosting gatherings in this very house, the rooms that had once echoed with laughter and music, now silent and empty of me. I was told to rest and take it easy, phrases that sounded gentle but felt like shackles, reminders that my role had been reduced to that of a passive observer. I began to notice the looks on the faces of the neighbors during brief encounters, sympathetic glances mixed with polite avoidance. Some spoke in hushed tones about the burden of caring for aging parents. Others offered hollow smiles that barely masked their discomfort. It felt as though my story was being rewritten without my consent, recast as a cautionary tale of decline rather than a continuing narrative of life and dignity. My movements within the house became more restricted. Stairs that I had climbed countless times became a source of whispered warnings. "It's safer to stay downstairs," Carla insisted, her voice soft but unyielding. The bedroom upstairs, once my sanctuary, was now off limits. I felt the walls closing in. The home I had loved transformed into a place where I was watched, managed, and ultimately confined. The emotional toll was profound. I found myself retreating into silence, withdrawing from conversations and interactions. The loneliness was sharp, compounded by the knowledge that this slow erasure was not accidental, but deliberate. It was a well-meaning but relentless squeezing of control, a tightening noose disguised as protection. I began to understand that the same house that had once been a haven was now a cage, and I was the prisoner. Yet amid the suffocating constraints, a small, stubborn flame flickered within me. I clung to memories and moments of clarity, the touch of worn wood beneath my fingertips, the scent of my old perfume lingering faintly in the closet, the sound of my own footsteps echoing in the empty rooms. These fragments of self became anchors, reminders that I was still here, still myself, even if others seemed intent on forgetting. I started keeping quiet observations, noting every change and every slight that chipped away at my dignity. I noticed the way Carla arranged the furniture not for comfort but for control, the way Daniel's eyes hardened when I questioned plans, the way the calendar was filled with appointments I hadn't chosen. Each detail was a thread in the tapestry of exclusion being woven around me. One particularly bitter morning, I discovered that a friend from church had called, but never left a message. When I asked Daniel why he hadn't told me, he shrugged and said, "You seem tired." The assumption that I was fragile enough to be shielded from the world stung more than any harsh words. I realized then that the first escalation was not just about my environment, but about my very identity being quietly dismantled. Despite the growing pressure to acquiesce, I began to resist in small ways. I insisted on driving to the market even if it meant a protest from Carla. I rearranged my books on the shelf exactly as I liked, refusing to let them be packed away. I took long walks alone, savoring the moments of freedom before returning to a house that no longer felt like mine. These acts were small rebellions, but they rekindled my sense of agency. It was during one of these walks that I found myself standing in front of the local real estate office, staring at the for sale signs displayed in the window. The thought of selling the house first crossed my mind as a desperate fantasy, a way to reclaim control from the slow suffocation. But it was just a flicker then, buried under the weight of obligation and history. Back at home, the routine of managed care and muted conversations continued. The house felt less like a refuge and more like a stage where my role was predetermined and my lines scripted. I was no longer a mother, a wife, or a woman with desires and dreams. I was a patient, a project, a responsibility to be managed. Yet the first escalation planted a seed of awareness that would grow into something stronger. I began to see the patterns, to name the silences and the dismissals for what they were, a form of erasure, a way of telling me without saying it aloud that my time here was limited, that my life was being rewritten without my consent. This slow, relentless tightening was not just a loss of space, but a loss of voice, and it was the first true test of my resolve. I realized that if I was to survive this new reality, I would need to find a way not just to endure, but to reclaim myself, to take back not only the physical space I once occupied, but the emotional and psychological ground that had been stolen. The first escalation was the beginning of a long, difficult journey, a journey from quiet submission toward fierce reclamation. It was the moment when the gentle insistence on comfort became a clear and present threat to my autonomy, when the house I had loved became a symbol of everything I stood to lose. But it was also the moment when I began to understand that I could still choose, and that choice would change everything. The turning point came not with a loud declaration or a dramatic confrontation, but with a quiet, solitary moment of realization that dawned slowly one evening as I sat alone in the dim light of the living room. The house was hushed around me, the usual sounds of activity replaced by an unsettling stillness that seemed to press in from all sides. The clock ticked steadily, a metronome marking time in a space that no longer felt like mine. I held the worn, leather-bound folder in my hands, the one containing the deed to the house, and stared at it as if it were a lifeline thrown to me in a storm I hadn't seen coming. The paper inside bore my name alone, untouched and undeniable, a quiet but powerful testament that despite everything, I still held something they had tried to take away: ownership, authority, choice. I remember the exact moment when the decision settled in my bones, a slow but firm resolve that this was no longer a situation I could endure passively. I was done being shuffled from room to room, done having my autonomy eroded bit by bit under the guise of care. I understood then that the house, with all its memories and familiar corners, was no longer a sanctuary but a symbol of the control others sought to impose on me. It was time to reclaim not just my home, but my life. That night, after dinner when the house was quiet and the world outside had dimmed into twilight, I made a call to a realtor I had met years before, someone I trusted but hadn't spoken to in a long time. My hands trembled slightly as I dialed, the sound of the phone ringing echoing in the stillness. When the voice answered, warm and familiar, I spoke clearly, telling her I wanted to discuss selling my house. The words felt strange and heavy, yet freeing all at once. It was not an act of desperation, but a deliberate choice, a reclaiming of agency that I hadn't felt in years. In the days that followed, I immersed myself in the process quietly and deliberately. I gathered the papers, signed forms, and attended meetings with the calm certainty of a woman who had finally decided to take her fate into her own hands. There were moments of doubt, of course, when memories tugged at me or when the enormity of the change threatened to overwhelm, but each step forward was a step away from the suffocation I had felt for so long. I was no longer waiting for permission or approval. I was acting for myself. The house itself seemed to respond to the shift. As I walked through its rooms, touching the worn surfaces and breathing in the familiar scents of wood and old fabric, I felt a strange sense of detachment and clarity. The walls no longer whispered of confinement, but echoed with the possibility of release. I began to pack away what I no longer needed, not out of sadness, but with a sense of purpose. Each item boxed and labeled was a small farewell, a recognition that while the past would always be part of me, it was time to move forward. I found unexpected comfort in this act of letting go. The old recipe box, filled with yellowed cards in my mother's handwriting, was carefully wrapped and set aside. The photographs of Daniel's childhood, once scattered on the mantelpiece, were gathered and stored with reverence. Even the garden, where I had spent countless hours tending roses and vegetables, was prepared for new caretakers with a mixture of melancholy and hope. It was not an end, but a transformation. The people around me began to notice the change. Daniel's calls became less frequent, but when they came, they carried a new tone, less dismissive, tinged with a reluctant respect. Carla's visits were polite but distant, as if they recognized that I was no longer a passive figure in their lives, but a woman who had reclaimed her voice. Neighbors who had once offered sympathy or avoided eye contact now greeted me with nods of quiet acknowledgement. It was as if the act of taking control had shifted the narrative, reframing me not as a burden, but as a force to be reckoned with. One afternoon during a meeting with the realtor, I found myself laughing softly at a joke she made about the quirks of real estate. It surprised me, this sound, this lightness that had been absent for so long. I realized then that the act of selling was not just about the house, but about reclaiming joy, possibility, and a future I could shape on my own terms. The sale was not a surrender, but a beginning. That evening, I stood on the porch watching the sun dip below the horizon. The sky painted in hues of orange and purple. The breeze carried the scent of blooming jasmine, a reminder of summers long past. I felt the weight of years lifting, replaced by a steady, quiet strength. I was ready to step into the next chapter, not as a victim of circumstance, but as a woman who had chosen herself. This midpoint was not a dramatic turning point, but a slow, deep shift, a moment of awakening that transformed my pain into power. It was the beginning of a journey not just away from what had been, but toward what could be. And in that quiet resolve, I found the courage to face whatever came next. The days following my decision to sell the house brought a surge of unexpected resistance and pressure that I had not fully anticipated, though perhaps should have expected given the delicate and often fraught nature of family ties tangled with years of unspoken resentments and fragile egos. When Daniel found out that the sale process had begun without his consent, though legally I was entitled to act on my own, his reaction was a mixture of disbelief, anger, and a palpable sense of betrayal that echoed like a slow rumble beneath the surface of our fractured relationship. It was as if my quiet act of reclaiming autonomy had cracked open a dam that had been holding back years of tension and unspoken grievances, releasing a flood of emotions neither of us were prepared to face. At first, his calls came in bursts, sharp, clipped messages left on my voicemail, full of accusations wrapped in the guise of concern. "Mom, are you sure about this?" he asked one afternoon, his voice tight with frustration. "This isn't the way we do things in this family. You can't just upend everything without talking to us." The words stung because they implied that my years of silent sacrifice and loyalty were irrelevant, that my choices were suspect simply because they didn't align with the plans he and Carla had made. There was an unspoken expectation that I should remain compliant, grateful even for the life they offered to manage on my behalf. When I didn't respond immediately, the calls grew more frequent, and soon Daniel appeared at the condo unannounced, standing in my doorway with a mixture of hurt and indignation that made me realize this was no longer just about the house. It was about control, about the narrative of who I was allowed to be within the family's story. His eyes searched mine as if looking for a flicker of the obedient mother he had known, the woman who had put aside her own needs for the sake of his convenience. But I was not that woman anymore, and I refused to play that part. Carla's involvement deepened in the days that followed. She arrived at my door bearing a carefully wrapped gift, a sleek tablet with a preloaded video call app and access to various health monitoring devices. "We want to make sure you're safe," she said softly, her smile tight but sincere. "This way, we can check in on you anytime." The implication was clear. They viewed me as fragile, as someone who needed to be monitored rather than trusted. I thanked her politely but left the package unopened in the corner of the room, a symbol of the overreach that I was quietly resisting. Their attempts to persuade me to reconsider the sale became more elaborate and emotionally charged. Daniel's voice, once firm and commanding, softened into pleading on the phone. "We're only trying to protect you, Mom. This house is a part of our family's future. It's not just yours to give away." I could hear the tremor of fear beneath his words, the fear of losing not just property, but control over a mother who had long been their anchor and caretaker. Carla called as well, her tone a mix of frustration and worry, sharing stories of friends who had struggled after selling family homes too hastily. They painted a picture of regret and loneliness, trying to paint the sale as a mistake from which I should be saved. I listened, but did not waver. I knew that their concern, however genuine it might have been, was intertwined with their discomfort at losing the role I had played in their lives, the dependable mother and grandmother who was always there when needed, but invisible otherwise. Their fear was understandable, but it could not override my need to reclaim my life on my own terms. I reminded myself that this was not a rejection of family, but an act of survival and self-respect. The social worker they enlisted was perhaps the most challenging encounter. She came with the air of authority and kindness combined, a professional tasked with assessing my capacity and well-being. The conversation was gentle but probing, with questions about my memory, my physical health, my ability to manage finances. I answered calmly and clearly, determined to demonstrate my competence and resolve. Yet, beneath the surface, I felt the weight of suspicion, the unspoken assumption that my desire to sell the house was a symptom of confusion or manipulation. I knew this was not the case, but the experience was a stark reminder of how easily autonomy can be questioned when it conflicts with others' expectations. Throughout this escalating tension, I found unexpected solace in the small acts of normalcy I preserved in my daily life. I continued to cook my own meals, tend to my plants on the balcony, and walk to the nearby park, savoring the moments when the world felt ordinary and mine to command. These acts were my lifeline, a way to anchor myself amidst the storm of familial pressure. They reminded me that despite the chaos, I was still here, still capable of making choices and living fully. The legal aspects of the sale progressed steadily, a silent battleground where my quiet determination met the undercurrents of family discord. The realtor, a steady and compassionate presence, guided me through the paperwork with patience and respect. She assured me that the transaction was legitimate and that I had every right to make this decision. Her confidence bolstered my own resolve, reminding me that I was not alone in this fight for my dignity. Meanwhile, the house itself became a symbol of the struggle unfolding in my life. Each visit to the property was charged with emotion. The rooms that had once held laughter and love now echoed with silence and uncertainty. I walked through the halls slowly, touching the walls as if to memorize every detail, knowing that soon these would belong to strangers. The kitchen, where I had baked countless batches of cookies and prepared meals for family celebrations, felt empty and foreign. The garden, once bursting with color and life, had been left untended, the soil cracked and dry. These physical reminders of my past were both painful and grounding, a testament to a life lived fully and now relinquished on my own terms. As the closing date approached, the pressure from Daniel and Carla intensified. They pleaded, argued, and at times resorted to guilt. "Think of the grandchildren," Daniel said one evening, his voice thick with emotion. "This house is part of their heritage." Carla echoed the sentiment, adding that they were only trying to preserve family traditions and stability. But I saw through the veneer. Their real fear was losing the role I had played, the control they exercised through proximity and caretaking. I stood firm. I would not be swayed by manipulation or sentimentality that sought to bind me to a life that no longer fit. The sale was more than a financial transaction. It was a declaration of independence, a boundary set against a lifetime of quiet sacrifice and erasure. The day I moved out was both surreal and liberating. I packed only what I needed: clothes, a few cherished mementos, the old recipe box that carried the scent of my mother's kitchen. I left behind the framed wedding photo of Daniel, placing it face down on the mantelpiece as a silent farewell. The house, once my sanctuary, was now a relic of the past, a chapter closed. As I locked the door one last time and handed the keys to the realtor, I felt a surge of emotion, not just sadness, but triumph. I had taken back my story, my life, and my voice. The future was uncertain, but it was mine to shape. The second escalation was not just a challenge from my family, but a test of my strength and resolve. It was the crucible in which I forged a new identity, one defined not by obligation or expectation, but by choice and courage. In that fire, I found a resilience I had long forgotten and the freedom to live on my own terms. The climax of my journey was neither loud nor public. It was a quiet act of profound finality, one that sealed the distance I had long felt growing between myself and the life I had once known. It was not a dramatic confrontation or a tearful farewell, but a deliberate and resolute gesture that marked the end of an era and the beginning of something entirely my own. In the weeks leading up to the closing of the sale, as the paperwork was signed and the keys prepared to be handed over, I found myself standing at a crossroads between the past and the future, grappling with the complex emotions that such a profound transition stirred within me. It was in this liminal space, suspended between what was and what would be, that I made a choice to claim my dignity, to assert my autonomy, and to set clear boundaries with those who had tried to diminish me. On the morning of my departure from the house, the air was crisp with the promise of early autumn. The sun filtered softly through the amber leaves that rustled quietly outside, casting shifting patterns of light across the wooden floors I had walked for so many years. I moved through the rooms slowly, deliberately, each step a farewell and a reclaiming. The walls, which had witnessed decades of family life, the laughter, the tears, the celebrations, and the silences, seemed to hold their breath as I gathered my few remaining possessions. I packed with care, not out of sentimentality, but with the solemn respect of someone closing a chapter with intention and grace. Before leaving, I stood in the living room and approached the mantelpiece where a framed photograph of Daniel's wedding day rested. It was a picture of a happier time, of promises made and futures imagined, but also a reminder of how far we had drifted. I turned the frame face down, a silent act of defiance and release. It was not a gesture of anger, but one of clarity. I was no longer defined by the expectations or disappointments of others. I was my own person, worthy of respect and love on my own terms. In the kitchen, I wrote a note on a piece of crisp white paper, folding it neatly before tucking it inside the cupboard where I knew it would be found. The words were simple, but carried the weight of years. This home belonged to a woman once. She left on her own terms. It was a message not to my son or daughter-in-law, but to whoever might come after, a testament to the life that had been lived within these walls, and a declaration that I had chosen my own path. The note was my final act of ownership, a reminder that though the house would pass to others, the spirit of the woman who had nurtured it would not be erased. As I stepped outside and closed the door behind me, I felt a mixture of relief and sorrow, freedom and loss. The neighborhood that had once been a familiar tapestry of faces and stories now seemed distant and foreign, the sidewalks and trees holding echoes of a life I was leaving behind. Yet beneath the ache of departure was a steady pulse of hope and determination. I was walking toward a future I had shaped with my own hands, a life no longer confined by the expectations or limitations imposed upon me. Moving to a modest condo near the train station was a deliberate choice, a space that was mine, manageable, and free from the shadows of the past. The rooms were smaller, the walls quieter, but they were filled with the promise of new beginnings. Here I could rebuild on my own terms, surrounded not by the weight of obligation but by the lightness of choice. I learned to make soup for one, to enjoy the solitude without loneliness, to savor the small pleasures of a life reclaimed. The responses from my family after the move were as varied as they were predictable. Daniel called, his voice a mix of frustration and resignation, trying one last time to persuade me to reconsider, to return to the role they had assigned me. I listened without anger, my resolve unshaken, and calmly told him that my decision was final. Carla sent messages laced with guilt and appeals to tradition, but I no longer felt the need to respond. I was no longer a vessel for their hopes or disappointments. Legal correspondence followed, with representatives seeking to ensure my well-being and questioning my capacity, but I met every inquiry with clear, steady answers and the support of trusted counsel. I was determined to protect not just my assets but my autonomy, refusing to be patronized or controlled. The house was sold, the keys handed over, and the final chapter closed with the quiet dignity of someone who had reclaimed her story. In the solitude of my new home, I found a profound sense of peace. The freedom to live without apology or explanation was a balm to wounds I had carried silently for years. I began to write letters, not to those who had tried to confine me, but to myself. Letters of forgiveness, of affirmation, of hope. I rediscovered parts of myself I thought had been lost: curiosity, joy, strength. Each day was a step away from invisibility and toward the fullness of life. The climax of my story was not a moment of spectacle, but one of quiet victory, a reclaiming of self that no one could take away. It was the day I closed the door on the past and opened the window to a future of my own making. It was the moment I chose freedom over fear, dignity over dependency, and love for myself above all else. And in that choice, I found not just survival, but life. In the quiet that followed the closing of the house sale and my move into a modest condo near the train station, I found myself settling into a rhythm I hadn't known in years. The mornings were gentler here, the sunlight filtering softly through the curtains, touching the familiar lines on my hands and the gentle curve of my smile as I brewed a cup of tea for one. It was a simple life, no grand gestures or dramatic revelations, but it was mine, shaped by choice rather than circumstance. The absence of noise, both from the neighborhood and from the tangled voices of family expectations, was a balm to my weary spirit. I could breathe deeply again, unburdened by the invisible chains of obligation and unspoken demands that had weighed so heavily on me. The condo itself was small but comfortable, a space that suited my needs and allowed me to rediscover the pleasures of solitude without loneliness. I began to decorate it with mementos and pictures that reflected not what others expected of me, but who I truly was. There was a vase of fresh flowers by the window, a small collection of books I had gathered over the years, and photographs of places I dreamed of visiting one day. It was a canvas on which I could paint a new chapter, free from the shadows of the past. I joined a reading group at the local library, a small but lively circle of women who welcomed me with warmth and curiosity. In those gatherings, I found not only companionship, but a space to share stories and listen deeply to others whose lives had been shaped by both hardship and resilience. It was in these quiet conversations that I began to understand the true breadth of my own strength, the ways in which I had weathered storms, survived betrayals, and yet still found the courage to hope and dream. Learning to make soup for one became a ritual of self-care and reclaiming joy in the everyday. The aroma of simmering vegetables and herbs filled my small kitchen, a comforting reminder that even the simplest acts could be imbued with meaning and love. I savored these moments of creation and nourishment, each spoonful a quiet affirmation of life lived on my own terms. Occasionally, my phone would ring with a call from Daniel. His voice was often hesitant, edged with the complexity of love, regret, and lingering frustration. Our conversations were shorter now, less frequent, but they held a new respect born from distance and the boundaries I had set. I no longer felt compelled to justify my choices or defend my autonomy. Instead, I listened with a gentle understanding that we had each traveled different paths, and that reconciliation, if it came, would come on its own terms. In the stillness of my new home, I often reflected on the journey that had brought me here, the slow unraveling of the life I once knew, the quiet acts of resistance, the moments of profound loneliness and fierce clarity. I understood that my story was not unique, but part of a larger tapestry of women whose voices had been silenced or sidelined, whose lives had been defined by others until they found the courage to reclaim them. To the woman reading this who may feel invisible or trapped in a house that no longer feels like home, I want to say this: you are not a fixture, not a burden, not a shadow to be managed. You are a person of worth and dignity, deserving of respect and the freedom to live fully. Your voice matters, your choices matter, and your life is still unfolding. Do not be afraid to say no, to set boundaries, to seek support. There is strength in vulnerability and power in claiming your own story. I did not need to die in that house, not in spirit or in silence. I needed to live, truly live, in a place where my voice could be heard, where my choices could be honored, and where I could find peace within myself. That peace is not a destination, but a journey. One I continue every day, one that I invite others to embark upon with courage and hope. As the sun sets outside my window, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, I sit quietly and breathe. I am here, I am present, I am enough.